Okay, so I successfully used the 2020 meme to help win RPG Superstar 2021. I wonder if I could rip off another 2020 meme to help make some traps for Trap Month. Ooh, I know. Mutated murder hornets. Today, we're going to be building some community-inspired hazards for Pathfinder 2e on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller offering game masters traps that they can send on the road with their players. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're going to be wrapping up Trap Month and I'm going to be building a couple of hazards for Pathfinder 2nd Edition using the Building a Hazard rules from the Game Mastery Guide in Pathfinder 2e and building off some of the inspiration that you, my community, have given me in coming up with these traps. Over the course of the last month, we've been talking about the rules for hazards in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In Part 1, we talked about environmental hazards, traps, and haunts. In Part 2, we talked about the distinction between simple hazards and complex hazards. And then last week, we actually took a look at the rules for designing hazards in Pathfinder 2e that are offered in the Game Mastery Guide. If you're interested in checking out parts 1, 2, or 3 of this series, I will have links to all of those down in the video description. But what's the fun of knowing how to do something and not getting to do it? Today, we are actually going to build some traps. And that is pretty much the entire intro to this video. So, really quick, do all of the YouTube stuff. If you enjoy this video, remember to like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget that you can check out my free Discord page along with my Patreon, both of which will be linked in the video description. And as always, we need to give a shout out to the sponsor for this week's video. So I want to give a huge shout out to the sponsor of today's video, ArcKnight. ArcKnight is a Texas-based company that makes beautiful and durable die-cut plastic accessories for TTRPGs such as flat plastic minis, object sheets, spell templates, and the number one reason they keep getting a lot of my money, RPG maps. ArcKnight sells a number of double-sided map packs that you can use for your TTRPGs that come with different themes such as wilderness or planar settings, or as you can see here, the Greystone Castle pack. Let's bust out these maps on the table and show you what they look like. So really quick, I'm going to show you one of the sample layouts that they give you for the Greystone Citadel. As you can see here, you have a moat and an entrance area. You have some basic fortifications for the castle, and even a throne room for your players to enter. Now the next thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to step back a bit. This is one of my old RPG maps, and you see the standard folds, crinkles, creases, and other wear and tear that is associated with your standard RPG map. But as you can see, my maps from ArcKnight are actually much flatter and in better condition, and the reason is these maps don't fold, they just store as is. This leads to a more durable product that gets less wear and tear as it ages. Also, I would like to zoom in and show you something really cool about ArcKnight's maps. As you can see here, I am one of those weird storytellers that likes to use hex grids instead of square grids. And the cool thing about ArcKnight's maps is you can custom order these maps in whatever type of grid you prefer. Do you prefer the normal square grids? You can order it that way. Do you want to custom order all of their maps with hex grids like I did? That's a possibility. And even though I don't have an example here, You can also order their maps completely gridless if that's your preferred playstyle. And to give you one more sample of what ArcKnight maps look like, here is a recent construction that I used in one of my games to create a tavern for my players to explore. As you can see, the map is colorful, has light sources indicated, and once again, allow me to point out that they allowed me to order it with a custom hex grid to fit my group's gaming style. So that's just a sample of the many different maps that ArcKnight offers. I love that these maps are beautiful, that they're durable, and very easy to store. These simple plastic sleeves tuck very neatly beside my computer desk and are very easy to store and access for my games. I really appreciate the fact that ArcKnight develops products that are easy to store as a game master, meaning that I have more room for, well, all of the other stuff in my gaming space. One last thing I'd like to say about ArcKnight is the incredible respect that I have for their team. I have been a customer of ArcKnight for years, backing many of their Kickstarters, even talking to them at Gen Con, and I have placed many orders with this company. And on the single occasion that there was an error with one of my orders, their customer service team worked quickly and efficiently to get that order fixed and sent back out to me. I'm impressed by their professionalism and by the quality of products and services they provide. So if you want to check them out, I encourage you to check out the link to their website in the video description. And thank you again, ArcKnight, for sponsoring this video. But the last thing we need to talk about real quick is the rules references. As always, I'd like to let you know where you can go to read up on this subject a little more in depth. The rules for using and building hazards can be found from pages 520 to 529 of the core rulebook, and from pages 74 to 91 of the Game Mastery Guide, and in particular today, we're going to be taking a look at the rules for building hazards, which are from the Game Mastery Guide, and we're going to be using tables 213, 214, 215, and 216 to design some hazards that you can use in your Pathfinder 2e games. There will be links to both hazards in the video description, and I will be posting both of these hazards on my free Discord page, so if you would like links to them, you can find those in either location. Alright, let's get started. So for today's video, I'm going to be building a simple hazard and a complex hazard using the rules in Pathfinder 2e. Now for the last month, I have been asking you all, my community, to suggest entertaining names for possible hazards that I might be able to use as inspiration for these hazards that I'm going to design. And for the simple hazard today, I have to say Stephen W.'s suggestion of the extended warranty hazard is probably one of the funniest suggestions that I got over the last month, and I knew I had to make an extended warranty into a hazard some way, somehow. Now, I will say that I feel like I'm stretching the definition of a simple hazard just a bit with this particular entry, but I feel like the rules work well here, and I had some fun with it, and extended warranty was just way too funny not to use, so allow me to present Abadar's extended warranty. This haunt was originally designed by the Church of Abadar to help counteract the work of thieves and rogues, and to con cons into abandoning their ill-gotten gains for hardly a copper piece. For a small fee, collectors can protect their prized possessions and pay a cleric of Abadar to place a haunt on top of a particularly important item. This haunt remains dormant as long as the item remains in its proper location in possession of its rightful owner. But if a thief should abscond with the item, the haunt will activate and begin to look for opportunities to, well, escape the clutches of the thief and work its way back to its rightful owner. Now, from our video on designing hazards, you may remember the extreme rule of 3, which is the general advice that when designing hazards, there should be one of 3 elements in your hazard that is extreme in terms of its statistics. It should either be extremely hard to find, with a corresponding stealth DC, extremely hard to disable, with a corresponding disable DC, or extremely damaging, with corresponding high damage output. For this hazard, since it is a sort of passive defense that a collector might use for prized items, I felt like this hazard should be very hard to find, reasonably difficult to disable, and honestly not damaging at all, because Well, honestly, a collector would not want to risk damage to their possessions. The first section of the stat block for Abadar's extended warranty will include its title and hazard level 4, and then underneath it, it will gain the haunt trait and the magical trait. As I previously noted, I wanted this haunt to be very difficult to detect, so I used the extreme stealth DC for a level 4 hazard, which is a stealth DC of 25. Ultimately, Abadar's extended warranty works best if the person encountering this hazard is not even aware that it is there. For the description, we note that an overzealous and miserly spirit conspires to trick a thief into selling their ill-gotten gains away in an effort to return those items to their rightful owners. Moving into the next section of the stat block, we move to the disable DC associated with this particular hazard, and in this instance I've chosen to give this hazard a disable DC of 22, and characters can attempt either a religion check or a society check to try to disable this particular hazard. The religion check represents the typical purging of the haunt that you can do through religion checks, and then I debated what I wanted the secondary skill option to be here. At first I thought about trying to use deception to try to persuade the spirit that you're actually the rightful owner of the object, but then I thought, no, this spirit's not going to fall for those tactics. It needs documentation, which means you're going to need to make a society check to show that you have legal ownership of this particular item. Now, this hazard is not intended to be damaging because, as I've noted earlier, it's protecting a prized item of some kind, and a damaging effect could damage the item itself, so rather this hazard attempts to deceive the thief into, well, giving away the item instead. I will admit I use somewhat vague language. What is a thief? What is a merchant? What is the rightful owner? But part of the reason I do that is I think it would make for interesting role-playing if characters could find a way to mess with the spirit's understanding of what these three terms mean. But the core ability that this spirit uses is called Bad Deal. It works like this. When the thief is bargaining or negotiating with a merchant of some kind, and here, as far as the spirit is concerned, merchant just represents anyone who might be capable of purchasing the item, the spirit will secretly and carefully cast the illusory object spell over the item in question, but in this case, the illusory object spell will be relative only to the thief. The spirit uses the illusory object spell to try to make whatever the stolen good is appear like a common or unimportant item that is already in the thief's inventory. So for a simple example, if the character stole a magical weapon of some kind, but was also in possession of some common weapons, the haunt might attempt to use the illusory object spell to make the magical weapon appear to be one of the plain weapons in the character's possession. At this point, the haunt notifies the merchant that the thief is unaware of the value of the item in their possession and attempts to persuade the merchant to offer the thief a very bad deal for this very valuable item in their possession. Oh, I'll take that old dagger off your hand for a few copper if you don't mind. The illusory object spell will last for about 10 minutes, allowing the merchant plenty of time to escape from the thief's vicinity. Now, I should note that this haunt will only use the bad deal ability if they believe that the merchant in question is someone that is reasonably likely to bring the item closer to the rightful owner. The plan here is simple. The haunt will regularly attempt to make a series of bad deals until ultimately the item works its way back into the hands of the rightful owner, and they see the value of the extended warranty that they purchased for their product. Since this haunt is intended to be the sort of effect that will replay several times until the item works its way back to its owner's hands, it is appropriate for this simple hazard to have a reset. And in this case, the spirit refreshes the necessary magic to reenact the bad deal ability once every day, so it'll refresh every 24 hours. Now, how can players defend against this? First, I should note that if the player is dealing with a scrupulous merchant or someone who would be opposed to trying to con a con, the merchant can resist the bad deal effect by making a will save at a DC of 22. Also, if characters are paying attention during the negotiations, you may allow them a perception check while they interact with the object in order to discover that it is under the influence of a spell, and that might further clue them into the fact that the item that they stole is in fact warded in some fashion. Since this hazard typically does not activate until it sees an opportunity to escape the clutches of the thief, your players may go a significant length of time before this hazard actually becomes relevant, and it could serve as quite the surprise if they suddenly realize that they have traded away such a valuable item. Now let's move on to today's complex hazard, the Alchemical Hornet's Nest. I imagine this particular hazard as a hornet's nest that has been built inside of an old abandoned alchemist laboratory, and the hornets in question have been feeding off of the strange liquids that the alchemist was brewing, leading to a rather dangerous environmental hazard. Now really quick, I need to shout out Torger from my Discord, who originally inspired the name Hornet's Nest for this hazard, but I also need to shout out Raphael S. and R.C. Craigo, who also offered some inspiration that played into the final design of the Alchemical Hornet's Nest. Looking at our stat block, we see that we have an Alchemical Hornet's Nest with an overall hazard level of 6. Now, I will tell you that in building out this particular hazard, I was looking at spells like Vomit Swarm and some of the negative reactions associated with alchemical mutagens, and between those two sources of inspiration, I ultimately settled on hazard level 6 as the appropriate range for this hazard, although this is very much a hazard that you could totally scale up and make much more dangerous. Now, we've already mentioned the extreme rule of threes, and for this particular hazard, since it's a big hornet's nest in the middle of an old alchemist lab, I don't expect it to be particularly difficult to notice, but I do feel like it should be pretty difficult to disable. So I have chosen to use the extreme numbers on the disable checks for this hazard, but we'll get to that portion of the stat block momentarily. First up, we need to talk about the traits for this hazard. It has both the environmental and complex traits, but since the source of this particular hazard is alchemical, it does not have the magical trait. Using the stealth DC table, I gave it a total stealth modifier of plus 15, which gives it an ultimate stealth DC of 25, which will influence how difficult it is to notice, and will guide what it needs to roll when it's time to call for initiative. The hornets in this nest have functionally been poisoned by the alchemical reagents that they've been ingesting, and the hornets are actually dead, but their bodies are still being animated by these strange liquids. For the description, we have a swollen and grotesque hornet's hive suspended above an alchemist lab, with discolored honey slowly dripping from the hive. Scattered on the ground underneath the hive are numerous dead hornets, but even though they have perished from ingesting alchemical reagents, if you look closely, every so often they jerk and move under the influence of alchemical mutagens. Functionally, I wanted this hazard to be reasonably easy to notice, but to be something that characters might overlook and think that it is a threat long since past. Moving into the next section, we begin with the Disable DC, and I intended for the Disable DC to be particularly difficult when it came to this trap. I gave it an overall Disable DC of 28, and characters can attempt either a nature or survival check to try to disable this trap. I did give this trap a distinct weakness in allowing characters to also attempt a crafting check to disable the trap at a lower DC of 23, but that lower DC of 23 requires characters to be very close to the trap while they are attempting the disable check, putting them ultimately at greater risk, so it kind of puts a little risk to reward in how your characters might approach the scenario. Now, one thing that I really like with complex traps is the idea that characters might need multiple successes to disable the trap, and the idea of those successes interfering with or interacting with the hazard's routine. And so I did that here. The Alchemical Hornet's Nest requires a total of 3 successes to fully disable, and when we go further in the stat block, you'll see that I've actually tied the different options to the routine of the trap. I will say if you wanted to scale this hazard up, you could easily require more successes here to make the hazard a little more difficult to deal with. Now, based off of the typical proficiencies associated with disarming hazards, characters that want to use nature or survival versus the Alchemical Hornet's Nest are going to need to be at least expert, But because I wanted to give this hazard a little bit of a weakness, characters need a lesser proficiency of trained if they're trying to use thievery instead. Up next, you'll see the armor class, fortitude save, reflex save, hardness, hit points, broken threshold, immunities, and weaknesses for the Alchemical Hornet's Nest. I do imagine this as the sort of hazard that PCs might attempt to physically assault, so these statistics were necessary for this hazard. The only thing particularly interesting on this point is I decided to give the hazard a weakness to fire, which I feel like is appropriate for a hornet's nest, but I would like to note for scheming storytellers out there, sure, the hornet's nest has a weakness to fire, but I would still hesitate if I was going to be flinging fireballs into an old alchemist laboratory. There might be some side effects from that. Just saying. If you can't tell, I like some risk and reward in how I design my encounters. But we need to see what this hazard actually does, so let's move on to honey drops. When a living creature moves within 10 feet of the alchemist hive, it triggers the honey drop reaction where some honey drops out of the hive and splashes all living creatures within 10 feet. Then the hazard will roll initiative like normal. Creatures within the range of that splash must attempt a DC 24 reflex save. On a critical success, they avoid the honey entirely. On a success, they become drained 1 for 1 round as they are exposed to the toxic honey. On a failure, they are drained 1 for 1 hour, and on a critical failure, they are drained 2 for 1 hour instead. This represents the toxic combination of alchemical substances eating away at the life force of the PCs, much like it did the Hornets. Once this splash occurs, initiative is rolled, and an encounter begins. The routine for this hazard has 3 distinct steps which occur in a specific order. First, a small swarm of wasps animates, responding to the movement of the alchemical honey. By the way, it's worth noting that a maximum of 3 swarms may be active at any one time, although this is another portion of the trap where you could increase the number of swarms if you wanted to make it more deadly. The second action in the routine is the swarm targets a living creature within 30 feet, and there are rules for determining how the swarm determines which targets it attacks. Then, for the last action on the round, another drop of honey comes out of the hive and splashes again in a 10-foot radius, affecting any living creatures who fail reflex saving throws, just like that initial honey drop. And then you just have this routine every single round. A swarm activates, up to a maximum of 3. The swarms attack a creature, and then more honey spills out, and your players are in a race against time to successfully deactivate this trap. Now, I have noted that each of the skill checks can interfere with this routine in a specific way. A successful nature check prevents a swarm from activating. A successful survival check successfully controls a swarm and prevents it from attacking for 1 round, and a successful thievery check prevents the honey drop ability from activating for 1 round. Once players get to a total of 3 successes, the hazard is disabled. This hazard will naturally reset on its own. If there are no living creatures within 30 feet of the hazard for 1 minute, then the swarms will drop dead and the hazard will deactivate. After an hour, enough hornets will have been reanimated through alchemical means that the hazard is considered active again. Now, one thing I would like to note about the alchemical hornet's nest, when I was building this particular hazard, I was basing a lot of the effects off of the Vomit Swarm spell, and when I checked the damage of Vomit Swarm, it was almost perfect to the recommended damage for a complex hazard that the Game Mastery Guide recommends. So if you're trying to figure out how to balance hazards or where they might be appropriate inside of the game, one of the easy things you can do is to use different spells or effects inside of the game as inspiration when you are building your hazards. In this case, a lot of the mechanical crunch of this trap is based off either the Vomit Swarm spell or the penalties associated with the Quicksilver mutagen. And the levels to access those spells and those mutagens lined up almost perfectly with level 6 hazard, so it was really easy for me to say, okay, this is the right place to use this particular effect. But those are the traps that I've built, and as I've said, you can find links to both of those in the video description, as well as on my free Discord. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What do you think about these traps? If you're a storyteller, would you be willing to use one of these in your game? Or what would you change about either of these traps before including them? Do these hazards inspire any ideas for your game? Or if you're a player, how would you feel if you ran into one of these hazards? Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to do all of the YouTube stuff if you enjoyed this video. Like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. You can check out my free Discord and my Patreon, both of which are linked in the video description. And one last time, shout out to ArcKnight, the sponsor of this video. Please don't forget that next week in the month of April, I am going to be cutting back on my videos somewhat, so expect a slower video production schedule next month, but I should be back to my normal schedule again in May. Anyways, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.